Greetings, stranger, and welcome to Ghastly Tales. Here you will find stories to chill your bones, stop your heart, and tear at your very soul. Now, pull up close to the fire and listen closely. Tonight we travel east, to the roof of the world, where a vengeful wind screams in the passes, where the valleys run red with the blood of the innocent, where dwell the acolytes of the Black Meal. By Aaron Vleck. Jeremy Saxon was a traveller. Late of Oxford, late of the Highlands of Scotland, late of the Amazonian rainforest, late of Kashmir and the Indian frontier, and a great many other inhospitable places, all that remains of Mr. Saxon's final adventure is a single handwritten journal. 0. The Himalayas. Two young monks scrambled through the knee-deep snow as they raced down the mountainside toward the monastery. Billowing crimson robes flapped in the savage winds as their breath stabbed the thin mountain air. The smaller of the two shouted as he tripped and fell. His companion turned, a look of fear and indecision clouding his eyes before he raced to his friend's side and dragged him to his feet. He paused when he saw a twisted grimace darken the other boy's face. Then he saw what his friend had seen. It was a hand, protruding a few inches above the snow as if the spirit of lonely places was about to drag them into its icy lair. As they labored to uncover the seemingly lifeless form, they stared in shock. Several things were remarkable about the body. It was warm to the touch, and very much alive. It was also naked, a white man with long matted hair and a reddish beard. He was in some sort of trance, and carried a leather-bound book under his arm. That he carried this book while dispensing with the least rag of clothing in such a climate as the roof of the world seemed utterly inexplicable to these young monks. The pair had left the monastery to bring supplies to the inhabitants of two isolated hermitages further up the mountain. Wooden doors and colourful flags indicated an otherwise hidden destination. There was nothing of comfort inside besides the prayers of the hermits, simple beds of straw on the stone floor, and the tea and sampa brought by the monks from the valley. The two boys had reached the hermitage that morning as dark clouds tumbled across the sky and icy winds threatened to carry them off into some distant abyss. When they reached the two small cells, they found the wooden doors smashed to splinters and no sign of their occupants. It was the other discovery that sent the pair scrambling back down the mountain toward human habitation and the council of the elder monks, the large quantity of fresh blood forming thick sheets of red ice on the stone floors of the cells. It was far more blood than the bodies of two sad hermits could possibly account for. Then they had found the man. A man they knew. His name was Jeremy Saxon. 1. 6 months later. I'd never heard of Jeremy Saxon before I visited a monastery in the Himalayan foothills during the fall of 2014. My Aunt Catherine, Mum's twin, had passed. She'd gone to Tibet during the 1960s and had never left. I hadn't seen her since I was a boy, but the news of her death still struck a sad blow. Mum had emailed me saying that the head of the monastery where Aunt Cat had lived had asked that I come as soon as possible to retrieve her few belongings. A strange request, I thought, but given my state of mind at the time, bored with everything that was my life, I jumped at the chance for any change of scenery. On the evening of the third day after getting the news, I was drinking tea with the abbot in his study. It was from the abbot that I first heard Saxon's name, and it was with a packet of photographs and the man's journal in hand that I went to bed that night. 2. The sound of a huge gong and the shuffling of feet outside my door told me I had slept through the night. I arranged the photos on the small wooden table and studied them carefully. They were all images of Saxon, taken in remote landscapes amid piles of hiking and expedition gear. Tall, robust, and outdoorsy, Saxon had the reddish blonde hair and heavy beard of a Highlander. The face would have been at home amongst Redmond Hillary's party as it camped on the slopes of Everest in the 1950s. The fierce and adventurous determination of an individualist stared out of piercing ice-blue eyes, and the well-formed mouth was always on the verge of a grin or in open laughter. An unusually keen intelligence was evident in the man's face, but there was something else. How do you describe a disturbing glance in a still photograph? I suspected that Saxon knew far more of the world than I ever would on my present course. As I examined each image, I found myself searching for what? Some sort of kindred spirit? He seemed to be inviting me to step away from my comfortably boring academic life and venture beyond the protecting light of mundane existence. I hadn't eaten or drank anything since my arrival except a few cups of tea in the abbot's study the night before. I laughed at myself, attributing my flights of fancy to my growling stomach and the rustic surroundings. The lamps scattered around the abbot's chamber had looked like pixies dancing in the shadows. The deep gong boomed through the ancient fortress like a huge preternatural heart, and hushed voices chanted invocations. All were long familiar features of the popular meditations of my age. Just as this thought broke the fog of my growing hunger, someone knocked at the door. A smiling monk handed me a basket of coarse bread and 2 pots, one with fresh water and the other filled with steaming tea. After making use of these welcome gifts, I set to work on Saxon's journal. Within the hour, the abbot appeared at my door. 3. After he left, I lay on the wooden bed heaped with coarse rugs and brightly coloured quilts, gazing at the stone ceiling that disappeared in the darkness overhead. There was something, the abbot had said, that I needed to understand, and other things to discuss after I had finished reading Saxon's journal. I sensed a furtive movement at the edges of my consciousness, like a door creaking open from which no light appears. It filled me with both foreboding and excitement. 2 states of mind I could not comfortably reconcile. It had not been for my amusement that the abbot had given me Saxon's account of his travels in the region, and the real reason I'd been summoned here was beginning to emerge. And Kat had been well acquainted with Saxon and his studies. Her death, now referred to by the abbot as her disappearance, coincided with Saxon's own final retreat from the scene. I sat down with the journal near a stone window that was flooded with morning light and watched the peaceful activities in the courtyard below. Then I looked towards the distant peaks as they rose above the snow and ice in the distance. Taking a deep breath, I returned to the book in my hand. 4. The journal was dense with notes, speculative observations, and disturbing questions. Unfamiliar names, whether of people or places I couldn't tell, were scribbled in the margins. The first part of the book was straightforward enough. Here were plans of a man long used to adventure, but one who foresaw the rending of some veil from which he would emerge completely transformed. I decided to ask the abbot if one of the monks could translate the journal's cornucopia of unfamiliar names and terminology. I had already made a list of unpronounceable words that I figured were important to my study. Then, my eyes fell upon these words. Finally, some success. I met an old beggar who claims to have served a few years ago as an adept in the monastery of, where the complete teachings and methods of sorcery and the black arts are practiced. He has given me clear directions to this place and an introduction of sorts in the form of a peculiar black medallion. At first glance it looks like the familiar image of the wheel of the Dharma, but it has 13 spokes, unlike the 12-spoked more commonly configured wheel. My contact still knows the old master there who teaches those who wish to undertake such dangerous initiations. He said he knew of the ancient rite known as the Black Meal, and that the Lama there could guide me if he thought I could survive it. I could hardly contain myself. The man said he would guide me himself, but he was too old and weak now to make the trip. In just 3 days' time I will leave these monks and the kind abbot for darker and more inhospitable places than these friendly walls and lush valleys. But I have to. I fear that it's my only course. I let the volume fall into my lap as I muttered silently to myself several times, "The black meal. The black meal." 5. The morning light faded as a bank of dark clouds came in from the north. I'd taken in all I could of the journal, so I went to find the abbot and we talked for several hours. When the afternoon shadows deepened, silent monks carried in the first lamps. Soon I was floating on warm currents of imagination that drifted into the darkened corners of the room like smoke. I returned to my room, enriched beyond my hopes. The abbot had spoken of those who followed the path of enlightenment as followers of the right-hand path. The followers of sorcery and the black arts, however, are the brothers of the left-hand path. But even within these obscure teachings there are many subtleties, ambiguous roads and unclear terrains and guarded passes which the adept must explore before he can fully understand himself. There were also some, he added, who sought to reconcile these two, the right and the left-hand paths, as one. This, he has assured me, was the most dangerous road of all. The old man paused for a moment, before saying something I will remember for as long as I live. "We do not believe," he said, slowly, "in good and evil as you perceive it in the West. Here there is subtlety, wisdoms far older than the clear polarities of your Western faith. There is balance to be found only in the whole, and sometimes even the most vile and hideous monster is the consort of the gods. It was to this path that Jeremy Saxon was called." 6. I ate alone in my room that night, not wanting any distractions as I continued the increasingly fascinating narration. July 15. This is wild, way beyond anything I imagined. I've been here at the Lamaserie for about 48 hours, and I've got to get all this down while it's still fresh in my memory. I've been on the road to the Lamaserie for over a week, and everything had gone well. The roads were treacherous, but the passes were still clear of ice and landslide. Priding myself on my stamina, I enjoyed my trek through the thinning mountain air. The old beggar's directions had been perfect. All the landmarks had appeared exactly as he had described. I cleared the final pass, nothing more than a steep, rocky footpath. There was the tiny whitewashed shrine, its long strands of colourful prayer flags fluttering in the blustery morning air. This was where I turned away from the road and began my ascent across the open snow. The frozen plateau ended at the foot of an unscalable sheer rock face that penetrated the canopy of clouds overhead. That rock face was my final destination. I trudged on for 2 days, but the precipice seemed no closer than when I'd first stepped off the road. It was near sunset on the 3rd day when I finally reached the base of the granite peak. Clouds raced overhead and I got a fleeting glimpse of the monolithic rock wall above. With my flashlight I carefully examined the area but could go no further. There was no hidden crevice or passage, no stupa, no sign, in fact, that any human had ever come this way during the past 10,000 years. I grew angrier by the minute, suspicious that the beggar might have sent me on some wild goose chase. Not wanting to continue my search in the dark and risk falling to my death, I made camp at the foot of the rock and figured I'd decide what to do in the morning. The first pale light of sunrise was colouring the sky when I was startled out of a deep sleep. I was on my feet in an instant as a deafening roar ruptured the perfect silence. I thought it was an avalanche, so I tried to determine what direction it was coming from. I grabbed up my gear and looked around but couldn't see any sign of activity on the ice-covered plateau or above me. Still, the hideous booming roar and its unearthly rhythmic echo filled the air. Mists that had obscured the upper peaks had dissipated overnight, and the rock face was now completely visible. I realized with shock that a noticeable crack had appeared on the surface. A perfectly straight line opened not far from where I stood, and divided the entire face of the rock. I numbly understood in that moment that this crack was the source of the noise and that in minutes I'd be a dead man, buried under tons of rock. I shook my head to clear the impossible image as the two sides of the wall of stone began to separate. I scrambled out of the way as a mammoth set of double doors, at least 50 feet tall, slipped open, displacing vast mounds of snow on either side. It crossed my mind that I was still sleeping, wandering lost in the valleys of bizarre dream, but this was all too real. Beyond the doors lay a broad courtyard and a magnificent lamasery of inestimable age. I marveled at the towering walls, the delicately carved roof shaped like drifting clouds that flowed into soft undulating waves. Mythic beasts out of legend, dakinis, wrathful deities, red-tongued dragons, and many other fantastical and marvelous forms stared down at me. Unlike the monasteries of the valley, with their happy whitewashed walls and wooden roofs, and doors splashed with bright colour, this place seemed to emerge from the black granite body of the earth itself. Lustrous as any gemstone, it showed not the least sign of antiquity. I almost didn't notice the stooping figure moving towards me. Dressed in the solid black robes of a sect I did not recognize, the man was probably in his 80s. He waved me inside and I followed him through the gates, which closed behind me as quickly as they had opened. We walked up a broad black stone staircase and across the deep courtyard to the mouth of a dark, cavernous temple. Its ornate pillars and sweeping roof curved away towards the heavens and disappeared in the gloom overhead. I realized that the temple, the broad stairway and courtyard, sat in a gigantic cave. I looked around but didn't see anyone else besides the old man. It seemed impossible that he could live out here in a place like this all by himself. We entered the temple and he motioned for me to sit down. The place was without light except for dozens of small lamps, and it took a while for my eyes to adjust. All the while, the old lama said nothing as I absorbed the majestic details of unfamiliar ritual architecture. My eye caught sight of a huge carving, no less than 30 feet in diameter, that covered most of the back wall. I reached inside my shirt and brought out the black medallion the beggar had given me as an introduction. There on the back wall was the same image, the wheel with 13 spokes. "Why have you come?" the old man asked, his voice cold and perfunctory. I was used to the meager light now, so I finally got a good look at his face. He had no eyes, only dark, shrunken sockets and a tracery of scars covering the brown leathered flesh. "Your eyes," I muttered, half in inquiry but mostly to myself. "They were burned from my head long ago," he replied without sentiment. "Who did this to you?" I asked. But he just croaked out a hollow, mirthless laugh. "I did this to myself," he said, "to be released from the sight of all but the vision." Then he lowered his head and said nothing for a moment. Then he looked up at me and hissed, "All but the vision." 7. The moon hung low on the cloudless horizon before disappearing behind the jagged peaks. Having finished this passage in Saxon's journal, I climbed into bed. Leaving the lamps burning, I turned my back to the wall and tried to sleep. A crawling sense of foreboding slithered over me, and I regretted ever coming to this place or even hearing the name of Jeremy Saxon. I might have slept, but a hesitant curiosity persisted in reaching out toward the journal. After an hour of tossing and turning, I grabbed the book from the table and ripped it open. No date. I have no idea how long I've been here. Several weeks, maybe. After the first night, there's been no sign of the Lama. I thought maybe he was ignoring me, so I'd just clear out, but food and drink and fresh lamps, even clean robes have appeared each morning outside my door. Maybe it's just some kind of test. I haven't seen anybody else either. I could be the only living thing on this whole damn mountain for all I know. I've made use of the sizable library and found a large collection of obscure texts on sorcery and black magical practices. The walls are lined floor to ceiling with long carved boxes containing ornate loose leaf and scroll texts, many over 500 years old. So far I haven't found any reference to the Black Meal, but there's got to be something here. And if the beggar was correct, the Lama here is at least familiar with the rite. What I found here is fascinating, and there's a lot of material that's completely outside my previous studies of Vajrayana Buddhism, and of the ancient Bone religion itself, a religion that has more in common with sorcery and magic than with Buddhism. 2 days later, late last night, I was jolted awake by pandemonium in the courtyard below. The crash of cymbals and the deep wailing blast of horns and voices raised in anger and distress exploded in the crisp night air. I threw off the furs that protected me from the bitter cold and scrambled to the window. Having not heard a single sound in this place since my arrival, besides the distant howling of the winds, I was completely stupefied. Looking down into the courtyard, I saw the half-distinct shapes of a large number of people. In progress was what looked like a ceremonial dance of the Tibetan demons in full regalia, their brightly coloured robes and hideous masks, framed like ghostly spectres in the pale moonlight. Screams of agony and the sharp report of rapid gunfire brought me to my senses. There was a knot of Chinese soldiers fighting with the dancers. Moving around the edge of the group was the old Lama, his arms gesturing wildly and his voice booming over the din in a cadenced growl. I raced downstairs to help the old Lama, but I had no weapon on me besides my fists and a black belt in Taekwondo. The people in the valley warned me about the presence of communist military forces in the area. They had already overrun Lhasa and the outlying monasteries, executing or imprisoning countless monks and nuns and setting fire to their libraries. I had seen no sign of them so far in my travels in the area, and this brought the warning back to my mind like a cold slap. One old blind Lama, no matter who he was, not even with the help of a bunch of village dancers, could stand against an armed cadre. When I got to the courtyard, I just stood there in confusion. It was dead silent. Both the soldiers and the dancers had disappeared, and the Lama was standing near the entrance to the temple. I rushed towards him, then stopped in my tracks. There in the shadows were the bodies of more than a dozen Chinese soldiers, all obviously dead and laid out in a row. The bodies were stiff and black like they'd been burned, and the throat of each man had been ripped open. The Lama stood over them as the blood pooled and lapped at his feet. His hands gestured over one of the corpses as he intoned words I couldn't make out, and then made a clean incision across the mouth with a dagger he took from the folds of his robe. I watched in fascination as he cut the tongue from the dead soldier's mouth. As he pulled the tongue out, his muttered incantations rose to an angry, throaty cough that tore into my brain like a clawed hand. Then, the Lama shoved the tongue into a leather pouch at his waist. Then he subjected each of the remaining corpses to the same ministrations. I turned and saw movement near the iron gates that stood open, ready to launch into the defensive if more soldiers appeared. I was surprised to see a pair of magnificent snow tigers prowling along the inside wall. I was about to yell a warning to the Lama when he motioned sharply for me to come away and return to my room. Glancing back at the gates, I saw that the tigers, like the ritual dancers, had vanished. My mind reeled with a strange fog, so I went back to my room. For the first time in my life, I was afraid. 8. I flung the book aside as if it had stung me. 2 days had passed and I had done nothing but devour Saxon's journal between brief bouts of fitful sleep. I washed up, then went and knocked on the abbot's door. He was translating a stack of manuscripts and welcomed me with a warm smile, but silenced me with a wave of his hand. After an unbearable silence, he spoke.
"My instructions to you are quite clear," he began. "Finish reading Saxon's journal. When you have some measure of understanding, then I will answer your questions and perhaps have more to tell you," he said, then paused. "Before that time," he continued after a few moments, "nothing I say will have meaning. and may only confuse and trouble you needlessly. Return to your room, eat the food that's been placed there in your absence, then come to me when you wish to hear more," he said, then summoned his attendant who appeared and showed me to the door. 9. I returned to my room and devoured the grain porridge that was waiting for me, savouring the similarity between Saxon's residency at the mountain lamasery and my own stay here. Saxon's silent, blind lama, and my own abbot who remained unforthcoming about everything, including the reason I had come here, my deceased aunt. Saxon's lama held him hostage to information about the Black Meal, and I was enthralled by the contents of Saxon's journal, and with the man himself. Yet neither of us was detained against his will. I sensed from Saxon's tone that some momentous crescendo was mounting, and that in some way it would spill over into my own life. It would have been easy to tell the abbot I didn't have any more time to spend on the journal, and that I needed to get back to my life, but I didn't. Instead, I returned to the journal. I could almost hear what I imagined to be Saxon's booming Scottish accent continuing the tale. The night of the new moon. Last night I saw eyes staring at me from the darkness. There can't really be anything in here besides me. I'm sure of it. The eyes are prowling in my dreams now. I haven't seen the Lama since the night the dancers appeared. Even the bodies of the dead soldiers have disappeared without a trace. I know, because I looked for them. This is a bloody nightmare. Waking, sleeping, it doesn't matter. I must be dreaming. But I cannot wake up. Silence grips this place like it did before the night of the bodies and the blood. I speak these words aloud as I write them, but I don't know why. By the rising of the half moon. Last night I dreamed of the ritual dancers. At least it looked like them at first. I thought I had woken up. I was moving along the stone hallway and down the stairs. Then I was in the courtyard, standing in the middle of a ring of the dancers, the same colourful, fluttering robes, the demon masks ghost-like in the moonlight, their faces drawn and animated with murderous grins and sharp, curving teeth. The costumed figures towered over me to a height of at least 7 feet. They danced in slow motion, graceful and silent, their long trailing robes floating as if on invisible currents. Moving in a circle, the lithe bodies wove an intricate spiral around me, and I was mesmerized. Overcome by the spectacle, I watched in fascination. They were ravishingly beautiful in their glorious hideousness. I wanted to fling myself into their embrace and run screaming from their presence. Then, a rough, unseen hand dragged me into the dance. A black female warrior demon wielding a long curved sword and a garland of dripping skulls falling over her huge breasts stepped in front of me. The blade flashed in the moonlight high over my head, a black flame arcing along its edge. Without warning, she struck me with the flat of the sword and I staggered under its incredible weight. A second dancer stepped forward and challenged me. His head was a cross between a vicious dog and some kind of panther. His robes and muscular body were the same bloody red all over. Curling horns disappeared into his mane and crimson smoke flowed from his broad flared nostrils. In his left hand he carried a large night-blooming lotus. He thrust the fleshy blossom under my nose, then shoved it into my hands. Noxious, heady fumes lit my skull on fire, and my brain exploded and poured down my face. A wave of ecstasy, unlike anything I have ever experienced, coursed through my veins. Only the stern faces of the dancers kept me in place and grasping my sanity. On it went until each of the 13 demonic figures had faced me and struck me with the ritual weapon they held. Each watched as I staggered back to the center of the circle and resumed my place in the dance. Another demonic figure raised a shard of living flame to my chest. A sentient heat reigned over my skull and quickened a rage so ravenous I feared I might consume the whole world in some cleansing orgy of blood and cosmic retribution. I moved from one to another of the demon dancers around the circle,
as they bestowed their dark and intoxicating benedictions upon me. Each blow transformed me into something, I knew not what. Every cell vibrated as a unique voice in the chorus of my body. I roared with the undifferentiated power from which all power is drawn, as from a volcanic well, as I was infused with the power of the weapons and they became my own. The last dancer carried in one hand a smoking bowl of blood, and in the other a Dorje wand. Dipping the wand into the blood, he shook it 3 times into my face, over my chest, and onto my bare legs. I melted into the earth, the bracing night air that whispered in my ear, and even in the bodies of the dancers. When I looked into the fierce, unhuman eyes, I knew they were not wearing masks. On the night the soldiers died, no simple village dancers had visited this place. 2 pulsing points of feral light padded silently through the snow towards the dancers, circling us, moving in opposite directions. It was the snow tigers I'd seen before. I felt no threat from any of this. The dancers had come to strip me of my humanity as they would a dirty robe from a corpse being prepared for burial, and I rejoiced. I awoke with a start and sat up in bed, disconcerted that such a fabulous vision should be just a dream. I got up to relieve myself before going back to sleep, hoping the dream would resume. That's when I noticed the splattered red stains on my legs and nightshirt, and the heavy cloying scent of some night blooming lotus on my hands. I went to the window and looked out, half expecting to see the demonic dancers and the 2 beautiful white tigers still moving over the snow in the courtyard. But everything was empty and silent. Even the winds had died down. I jerked around in surprise when the door swung open and the old lama entered the room. "Come," he barked, motioning me to follow him. Then he disappeared into the hallway, the sound of his bare feet padding over the cold stone floor. "Come quickly," he added sharply as I raced after him. 10. I sat thinking about everything I had read so far. A week ago I would have taken it all with a huge grain of salt. Stories like this tend to fall into one of 3 categories: the troubled ramblings of the insane, the delusions of the drug-addled, or the outright lies of the charlatan. That Jeremy Saxon was none of these things I was certain. In this monastery among smiling monks and the sound of gongs and constant chanting, the journal was eroding the borders between the real and the imaginal, and I still believed that Saxon's account related actual events, free of poetic license or delusional fantasy. The sun was setting, but I was determined to finish reading that night. There is no time. This is my last entry. There's no reason to keep writing about things now. The night I encountered the 13 demons, the Lama had ordered me to accompany him to the temple. I knew the demonic figures were not village dancers, nor were they the product of any imaginative dreaming. We sat for a few minutes on the stone floor of the temple. Then, with words devoid of any feeling, the Lama proceeded to destroy whatever was left of Jeremy Saxon. "You have come here looking for something," he stated flatly. "You are a man possessed by a singular idea. Very few could have reached this place alone and without a guide. Fewer still would have remained patiently outside, camped at the very doors of what they sought but could not see. It was not your worthiness that opened those doors to you," he continued. "You believe I have ignored you since you arrived, and I have, not as any test, not because I wanted you to leave, but because I had no thought or concern for you at all. You wonder at the food and drink placed at your door each day. That was no kindness on my part, nor was my absence any sort of punishment. It was nothing. There are many mysteries within this place that none may ever fully understand. I am one of them. I serve no one here but myself, and the 13 wrathful ones who serve me in turn. They came to you tonight. They have accepted you. You desire the black meal. Because it is their desire, I will assist you in becoming one with what you seek. Tell me this, Mr. Saxon. Do you still crave this right so badly? If you do, submit to it now, or leave in the morning at first light without another word. You have the length of time to decide that it takes you to release that breath you are holding. He must have put me into some kind of trance, because the next thing I knew I was outside in the cold, naked and lashed securely to a wooden pole. The snow was blowing so hard I couldn't see a thing besides the llama who stood so close to me I could smell his breath. Despite my nakedness, sweat poured from my body. "Wake from the red slumber and come forth," the old llama roared, arms thrown wide toward the sky, his black robes billowing like raven's wings around his withered body. I was here of my own free will. All I could do was endure what was to come. You want to know why your body is warm when you should be dying from exposure? The llama said into my ear, echoing my own unspoken thoughts. It is the tumul, the inner heat, one of the 4 great gifts the wrathful ones have placed within you. Another is the lung gom pa. It will enable you to cover great distances within the span of 2 breaths. You may now walk into and out of the world as you desire, and defy all the laws of men placed upon you by men. The llama had begun to dance around me counterclockwise, muttering under his breath. He stood in front of me again and I looked into his face. Gone were the dead, empty sockets of a blind man. He had eyes, but they weren't those of any man. They were the eyes that had haunted my room at night and prowled my dreams. You sought the black meal having no idea what it was, and so the black meal has sought you. It is not a meal that you may consume. You are consumed as the meal, he cried. Recognize now what seeks you. He stepped away, and I saw the form of something racing toward me over the snow. A man in furs. No, it was a creature, a tiger. I lost sight of the creature for a second, and then it reappeared. It was a man. I could see his face twisted, feral and brutal. Then he dropped down on all 4s and bounded towards me. I heard laughter all around me, the laughter of unseen persons or hungry demons riding the wind. Then the man leapt through the air in the form of a tiger and was upon me. I saw in the furious blur of flesh and fur the face of an insane man of vast unhuman wisdom. His flesh withered and brown. Dressed in tiger pelts, he had bone fetishes and carved things dangling from his neck and tied into his long matted hair. As the creature ravaged my body, I saw the tiger's face, felt its warm muzzle and thick coarse fur as long sharp claws and teeth tore my flesh. After a few moments, everything went black. I felt my blood flowing down my arms and legs from a dozen savage wounds to mix with the snow at my feet. I flowed over the open snow, like froth on a roiling sea. My feet, all 4 of them, coarse, furred and clawed, carried me deeper into a world devoid of color and shame. Earth and sky all one, white in the dying evening light. I was aware only of the rhythms of my body, grey and black fur to hide from the eyes of my prey as I prowled for him among the rocks. Claws to rend his flesh from the bone, and teeth to crush that bone and suck out the life and marrow. I longed for the prey. I searched for the smell of his fear on the bitter night winds that would guide me to his hiding places. The presence of another creature prowled nearby, large and menacing, with a mind that sought to penetrate my own to compel me toward his will. The snow in front of me exploded in a geyser of black fur. Eyes the color of an inferno lapped at my brain like tongues of fire. He was not the prey. It was a gigantic black tiger. I knew this creature. He spoke to my mind, not with words but with pure desire, and I answered him. It was the blind llama whose name I still did not know. I, however, had once been called Jeremy Saxon. I chased the black tiger down the powdery slopes to the lower rocky outcrop. I have no idea how far we travelled before we reached the caves hollowed from the rock face. Hermitages, I remembered. These were the retreats used by monks from the monastery in the valley. As we got closer, I smelled smoke and heard loud, angry voices. Something wasn't right. My companion leapt onto one of the doors and it crashed under his weight and splinters. The angry voices turned to screams of fear and horror. A crunching sound of shattering bone filled the air, and the sweet smell of flowing blood filled my nose. Then the llama was urging me to feed, to break into the other hermitage and devour the lives of the men hiding there. Hiding. There were no monks hiding in these cells. I didn't understand, but my hunger shoved everything else aside. I padded over to the other hermitage and broke down the door. Huddled inside were 7 men. They were dressed in the ragged uniforms of the Chinese army. I glared at them in contempt as they cowered in front of me. I could see the black and bilious traceries of sadistic greed coursing around each trembling figure. In that moment I understood. These were the survivors of the attack on the lamasery the night before. These men had stormed our doors and sought to kill an old blind lama and destroy the walls of his temple and the library I had come to love. To escape the wrathful dancers, they had abandoned their own companions to their fate and hid here like cowards. In that moment I understood the blind lama's commands. I snarled once, baring my fangs in rage and hunger. Then I was upon them, ripping the life from each and spilling their blood across the stone floor of the cave. I have never known such pleasure, such fulfillment as when my mind fled shrieking down some dim hallway into the dark places in my brain, and the calling of the black meal rose within me as a hot, red tide. Over the screams of dying men, I heard the lone cry of a huge, black tiger. Then I heard the cries and growling of many others in the distance out in the snow. I lifted my head and answered them, then returned to my solitary feasting. Later, as I dozed in the pleasant haze of blood, I heard another sound. It was the clashing of cymbals and the deep wailing blast of horns. The wrathful dancers had appeared. One by one, they pulled the lifeless, half-devoured remains of the men from the caves. Then they were gone, dragging the evil corpses off to what final resting place I could not imagine. Then I slept. 11. That was the end of Saxon's account. I ordered my thoughts and then climbed the steps to the abbot's sanctuary.
"Hold your thoughts until I've had my say,"
he requested.
"Call it a postscript if you wish. It's also time to hear Catherine's part in the story,"
he continued, his eyes narrowing. The abbot's tale.
Communist troops had overrun this country. Thousands had been killed. Monks, nuns, the common people. Many more were driven into exile. They'd finally reached this peaceful valley, and I knew our simple life would soon be destroyed. One night I was unable to sleep. As I watched the moon disappear behind the distant peaks, I looked down and I saw a man standing near the gate. Then I saw an unbelievable sight. The man dropped to all fours and dashed across the courtyard. He stopped right below my window. It was a magnificent black tiger. Then he stood upright again, and I saw to my great surprise it was a man after all. I shook my head and even splashed cold water in my face, but he was still there, staring up at me. I knew somehow that he wanted me to come down and speak with him,
the abbot said, shaking his head with a smile at the memory.
In my boyhood, I loved all the stories of men and women who could turn themselves into animals or demons or even into the wind itself. We do not take them lightly. But when boys become men, they find other ways of making sense of these tales that don't include tigers turning into men and demanding your counsel in the dead of night. I am a man of advanced years and experience, but what I saw in that moonlit courtyard was as great a shock to me as anything you've read in Saxon's journal. There stood a creature from my boyhood stories, a man who could transform himself into a tiger and back again before my eyes. I thought he must be an evil magician, a monster, a hungry demon known to the bone sorcerers. He was all these things, and he was the answer to all my prayers. I went down to the courtyard. Without a word, the man grasped my hands and looked into my eyes. For all my years, I shook like a schoolboy as the creature wordlessly communicated his message to me. He was a bone sorcerer, an initiate of the Black Meal, and he had come from a lamasery hidden among the highest peaks of this mountain. Yes, Saxon's Lama, the very same man. I had heard of this place and this man-creature even as a child, but I'd always believed it was only a legend, a metaphor, or some story used to scare boys like me. What the creature proposed was that we join together as one path, as it had always been meant to be,
the old abbot said, his voice little more than a whisper, his eyes gleaming.
As the man spoke, I heard the sound of howling all around me. My flesh prickled and I feared for my life.
The abbot added, smiling.
Then the sorcerer revealed the power of the Black Meal. I heard other voices in my mind, on the wind I could not tell. Nearby, there were many such creatures, hungry tigers with the heart and spirit of a man. Through the rite, a ritual of blood and terrible violence, a miraculous blending of man and ghost tiger took place. Despite their great capacity for evil, it was an evil that could bring justice to the true monsters from the lowest pits of human depravity. I knew the Lama was talking about the soldiers. I could see them in his mind. I witnessed the wanton slaughter in our villages and monasteries. I felt the sadistic joy that consumed these men, drove them to terrorize and exterminate the innocent, and it sickened me. And I had to ask, what is evil? Who truly is an evil man? Then the Lama told me of the wrathful demons. I could feel their power in my mind, pounding within my brain. I saw them. I almost collapsed under the weight of their touch. Finally, the Lama showed me the terrible bloody dance the wrathful ones performed upon the bodies of their victims. How can I explain?
The kind old abbot continued.
In that moment, without hesitation, our eyes locked and I grasped the creature's mind and agreed to all. Then he silently conveyed to me what I must do. These creatures, the spirit tigers that surrounded us, whose infernal howling ripped the wind from the sky, were his own acolytes, monks and nuns who sought the darker teachings of bone and whom he had initiated into the Black Meal. Together they would drive the soldiers back across the plateau, those who escaped the red feasting of the meal. For my part, I would send those monks who desired the darker path to him. They would go to the mountain retreats and await the Lama, who would guide them to the hidden Black Lamasery. A year ago, Jeremy Saxon passed through here, on his way there. During his stay of several weeks, Saxon and your Aunt Catherine spent a lot of time together talking. Despite the great age difference, they got on very well, and I was glad there was another Western person for her to talk to. Eventually, Saxon left and continued his journey to the Lamasery. 2 months ago, young acolytes bringing food to the hermitages returned to us in a state of panic. The cells were broken into and defiled by blood, and the monks had vanished. Returning down the mountain in haste, the boys discovered Saxon buried in the snow. In his hands he carried the journal you've just completed. I knew he had not abandoned the course of his path. The Lama ordered him to consider carefully what lay ahead of him. He had to find his way back to the Lamasery on his own, or abandon the dark path of the spirit tiger, Catherine and I tended to Saxon's recovery. One night, 10 days after he fully regained his strength, Saxon disappeared. He left behind nothing but the journal. Catherine was very upset by his departure, gravely upset. I ordered her to her room for rest and retirement from communal activities. A week after Saxon's disappearance, she wandered outside in the courtyard, dressed only in her night clothes, barefoot and speaking incoherently. She was burning up with a fever. I assigned 2 senior monks to attend her, and then I returned to my study. As I sat there, very concerned for Catherine's health, I heard the howling of the spirit tigers outside the monastery walls. 2 nights later, Catherine called me to her room. She begged me to see that Saxon's journal made its way into your hands. She told me your name and asked that I contact you, invite you here, and give you the journal. Then she lapsed into a deep sleep. I retired to my room, planning to continue our conversation when she awoke. By the next morning, Catherine had vanished. We searched for her for several days. There was no sign of her, so I contacted your family and asked that you come immediately. In the days that followed, I learned from the Lama that Catherine had joined Saxon there and had undertaken the Black Meal herself. Unfortunately, the soldiers are encroaching closer upon us with each passing day. It is no longer safe here. If you want transportation back to the village so that you can get out of the country, I can arrange it. In the light of Saxon's journal, you must make of these matters what you will.
12. I must have had some kind of fever. I vaguely recall walking a few steps down the hall, a gentle hand on my elbow urging me forward, and then nothing. Later, as I sat on my bed trying to make sense of everything, I wondered if I was on the verge of some breakdown or a serious illness. I was at a loss about finishing the journal. Some unveiling of the mysteries had suddenly evaporated like a dream in the morning light. Lying in bed, hoping for sleep to deliver me to a few hours of mindless oblivion, I started dreaming. Not the pleasant escape that comes with the ordered fairy tales we allow ourselves at the portals of sleep. This was a cacophonous plunge into a maelstrom of disjointed, menacing images worthy of any nightmare. Angry faces leered at me out of a boiling red fog. Smiling monks melted into old blind lamas robed in black. These gave way to roaring tigers slathering blood-drenched fangs, which faded into still photos of Jeremy Saxon dancing in the snow. The concerned face of the abbot broke through the haze, and I realized he was there, his hand on my shoulder. My mind cleared. I was outside in the snow. I was horrified with embarrassment when I realized I was also naked, barefoot, and surrounded by a group of monks, their faces beaming with gentle kindness. All I could do was surrender to their aid as the abbot took me back to my room and put me to bed. Then I slept in merciful emptiness. 13. Emerging from another disjointed dream, I sat up and looked around. I could make out the shapes of 2 people sitting beside me in the twilight. One of them was my mother. Not her. Someone older looking, but the same. Her long braided hair hanging over her shoulder to her waist. And Cat? I barely choked out the words. What are you doing here? I was no longer in the monastery. I was lying on a bed of rough furs in a room carved from solid, black rock. Aunt Catherine smiled and left the room. I was alone with a man who could be none other than Jeremy Saxon. His face was weathered, but I would recognize him anywhere. His eyes burned with compassion and something else, something that caused me to look away. I see you found your way here, he said, his voice friendly and good-natured. Glad you're awake. That says something. Sleep now. Then eat, drink, and hear what Cat and I have to say, he added. We'll be back later. Then I fell back into the warm furs. and for all I knew, the world ended. 0. 6 months later. I plowed through the snow as if I was born in it. Nothing existed in all of time and space except my powerful body and the ocean of soft white cushioning my feet and luring me deeper into its icy loveliness. Then I smelled something in the air, something sweet, hot and metallic. I tasted it on my tongue and in my nostrils. Even my lungs moaned in anticipation. Then I heard a roaring scream soaring through the mountain air. It exhilarated me and I had to answer. I sat back on my haunches and lifted my face to the sky. My throat emptied and my song filled the air, joining the chorus of an army of voices like my own. Then I saw the powerful furry body streaming down the ice-covered rocks. I paused at an outcrop and looked down. A narrow, mud-soaked road scarred the deep gorge below. 2 of my companions came to stand beside me, massive, gorgeous creatures out of legend. They had the form of the tiger, but the heart and the soul of man. The larger of the 2, the male, gestured toward the road below. The other, the female, snarled viciously and bared her fangs. The first of the trucks appeared. Then the whole convoy came into view and rambled along the road. There were 5 camouflaged vehicles with large mounted guns and soldiers hanging off the sides. They were heading for the monastery in the valley, the home of our friend the abbot, and hundreds of monks and novices. I heard growling swell all around me as the rest of our clan joined us. Dozens, hundreds pouring over the snow. My 2 companions, those who at times resembled Jeremy Saxon and my Aunt Catherine, snarled as they exploded over the rise and headed towards the road below. We moved like a wave of white, black and yellow fur. Teeth and claws bringing death rained down on the convoy like hell from the skies. Later, after we had sated ourselves on their flesh, I heard the clashing of cymbals and the deep wailing blast of horns on the wind. We dispersed, melting back into the broad plateau of ice and rock. Then the gods came. They left behind nothing but empty trucks, unfired guns, and great quantities of blood. This has been a Ghastly Tales production. Narration by Martin Yates, story by Aaron Vleck. Accompanying music by Kevin MacLeod, with additional music by Michael Whitehouse. For full credits, please see the description. I hope you've enjoyed this reading. If you have, you can check out more of Aaron Vleck's work at aaronvleck.wordpress.com. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to Ghastly Tales on YouTube and stalk Ghastly Tales Presents on Facebook for more horror narrations, dark documentaries, short films, and live-streamed hangouts with the Ghastly Tales Cabal, amongst other delights. If you prefer your chills on the go, our narrations and spoken word content is available as the Ghastly Tales Horror Show on iTunes and through all good podcasting apps. The Ghastly Tales Horror Show has been ranking consistently in the top 100 performing arts podcasts according to podcastchart.com. Your host has never been ranked in the top 100 of anything before, so thank you to those who have supported us by subscribing to the podcast, and we promise not to let it go to our heads. Good night, listener, and sweet dreams.